Steve Cushman, former president of California Historical Radio Society, project manager, and on the board of directors. As part of our Living History series, we like to bring in people who have had an impact on our lives because of radio. And one of the most impactful people on local Bay Area radio here was Dr. Eugene Schoenfeld, sometimes referred to as Dr. Hippocrates. And he is with us here today to tell us his great stories. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve. I'd like to thank Rachel Lee and the California Historical Radio Society for inviting me here. I feel it's a great honor. I'm going to be talking about what led up to my being in radio, and then focus on my adventures and misadventures in radio. So I'm going to start with my grandfather, Nathan Freed, who came to the United States in 1913. And he was going to work for a year and then send for his wife, my grandmother, and my mother and her younger sister, who had remained in the Ukraine. So he had hoped to bring them here in 1914. But then the First World War broke out, followed by the Russian Revolution. They were separated for 9 years. Occasionally letters would get through. But finally, my mother and her family came to England in 1922. And 5 years later, my grandmother died. And somehow, I don't know how it happened. I learned about some of these things only when I was adult, because my family, my parents didn't want to talk about such things. For example, she had dated, when she was a teenager, the gangster Legs Diamond. And her younger sister, my Aunt Faye, married a young doctor named Arthur Vigdor. Arthur Vigdor was a nephew of Arnold Rothstein. Arnold Rothstein, of course, fixed the 1919 World Series by bribing 8 of the Chicago White Sox to throw the series. So, that was one of the things they didn't like to talk about at that time. But Arthur Vigdor was our family doctor for years until my family moved to Florida. And his wife, my Aunt Faye, died in childbirth. It was very traumatic. Still, for years, it was difficult for me to deal with matters of death. She was so upset by what had happened. Rothstein was a mentor to Meyer Lansky, who was the brains of the mob. My father started out as a plumber, and then he became a plumbing contractor and did very well. He did the plumbing work for a lot of the hotels which still exist in Miami Beach, like the Eden Rock Hotel, things of that sort. He did well enough to send me, my brother, through college and medical schools. He worked with a general contractor who had been a childhood friend of Meyer Lansky. So, there's Rothstein. So my parents were invited to Havana to have supper with Meyer Lansky and his associates in Havana because they were planning to build casinos in Havana until Castro took over. After, years afterward, my father would say, well, they made him an offer he did refuse because he was too busy with, you see these slides are moving by themselves. He was too busy to go to Havana. He didn't speak Spanish anyway. I mentioned that. I mean, most of my talk will be linear, not all of it, because my parents also had, in the film Godfather 2, Lee Strasberg plays the part of Meyer Lansky. So my parents also had an opportunity to have supper with Lee Strasberg because his daughter, Susan Strasberg, who was a well-known actress at the time, Susan Strasberg was engaged to my uncle, Martin Fried. That didn't work out, and he married another member of Actors Studio, Brenda Vaccaro. Brenda is best known for her role in Midnight Cowboy. Every now and then I'd run into Brenda somewhere and we'd kind of joke around because she was my aunt through marriage. And she was a few years younger than I am. She's 3 or 4 years younger than I am. I'll be 91 in 3 days. Well, after 5 years, Brenda started an affair with Michael Douglas, and they were engaged for a time. One time I was at a party in San Francisco that was also attended by Michael Douglas and his friend Jack Nicholson. So I had a long chat, not very pleasant, with Michael Douglas about my uncle and the fact that Douglas was hitting on the 16-year-old daughter of a friend of mine at the party. Anyway, so there's that. But when I was born, I was a red diaper baby. You all know what red diaper babies are? The children of communists. There were a lot of us. For example, Country Joe McDonald, who died last week. Well, Joe is after Joseph Stalin. And the fish with Barry Milton, well, Barry was named after an Irish revolutionary named Barry. So there were a lot of us brought up that way. I remember in our apartment in the Bronx, there was a bas-relief on the wall of Lenin. My middle name is Lenin, a name I stopped using during the time of the McCarthys. It's Lenin. And my first name, Eugene, is after Eugene Debs. And curiously, I learned later that Eugene Debs was related to Albert Schweitzer because the Debs family was from Alsace, where Schweitzer was from. Also, Jean-Paul Sartre was also related to Schweitzer. And Schweitzer's daughter, Rena, who had become a good friend of mine, told me that sometimes her cousin, Jean-Paul Sartre, would babysit for her. So anyway, it's curious. Well, So I graduated from UC Berkeley, and then I did a couple of years of graduate work there and was admitted to the University of Miami in Florida, where I'd grown up. At that time, there was segregation in Miami. The black wards were ill-kempt, not air-conditioned, dirty. It was not good. And a obstetrical resident, Tom Brewer, and I started the integration of the hospital by taking our meals in the black cafeteria. That was 1958 or so. So as I said, I interned at Herrick Hospital, and one of my mentors there, one of them was the father of John Hammond, who's going to be playing. By the way, I'm going to have a birthday party in 2 weeks from today at the Throckmorton Theater in Mill Valley. You are all invited. There's no admission. I hope you'll be able to come. One of the doctors at Herrick had just been appointed to Yale University, and he knew about, by then I'd had experiences in Africa, which I'll get to. And so I went to Yale. I got a master's in public health there. Because of experiences I'd had in Africa, I became interested in public health. And before that, I'd applied to some of these shipping companies because I was thinking, while I was going through medical training, there are so many opportunities for doctors to do different things. And I thought, well, I'll try being a ship's doctor for a while. So American Export Lines contacted me, and they said they had just assumed control of the first American nuclear-powered freighter, the Savannah. And would I like to be a doctor for that? I said, sure. So there was a big ceremony in New York, and I went down, gleaming white shit. But they had troubles operating it, and many ports would not allow it in, particularly Japan. They didn't want a nuclear-powered freighter in their port. Understandable. So I was a ship's doctor for a summer. I liked the fact that I was taken to places I'd never been, like Casablanca, Alexandria, and Egypt. But I felt rootless. So anyway, I just did that for a summer, and then I worked on a nursing home project, which involved my visiting all the nursing homes in Alameda County, including some here in Alameda. Well, during medical school, in my second year in 1958, I met Gregory Hemingway, who was Ernest Hemingway's youngest son. And he and his roommate, Bob Kyle, were planning a safari to Angola. And they invited me to go along, thinking that I knew something about medicine. I was only a second-year student. I didn't know much about medicine. But I went to some of my professors and asked what kind of supplies, I should have. Got that, and we went to Angola. And I had a letter of introduction to the chief doctor at the C.H.R.S hospital, Frank Catchpool, who had lectured at my school when I was a freshman medical student. So after our safari, in which, we killed an elephant, I went to the Albert Schweitzer Hospital. And that was the summer of 1959. At the Schweitzer Hospital, of course, nothing was killed unnecessarily. And it was an embodiment, the whole hospital, of his philosophy of reverence for life. It certainly changed my outlook. I guess there's a picture of me standing next to that elephant. So I spent 2 weeks there. I became friendly with Dr. Schweitzer's daughter, Raina. When I returned to medical school, one of my professors called me in, and he said he'd just been made head of a Smith, Kline & French pharmaceutical company fellowship that was sending medical students to remote parts of the world to get different kinds of medical experience. He said if I got a letter from Dr. Schweitzer, he would arrange for that for me. So Raina Schweitzer arranged for her father to send a letter inviting me. And so I was able to spend the summer of 1960 at the Schweitzer Hospital. And again, it reinforced, what I had learned before. I mean, nothing was killed unnecessarily there. This slide you're seeing now, Papa's Boy, later, well, I'll talk about that a little later, but I had wanted to go back after that summer. I thought about joining the Peace Corps because I knew they had a contingent in Gabon. I met with Sergeant Shriver, who interviewed me. But they wanted to send me to Nepal, and I wanted to go back to Gabon. So it didn't happen. But by now, Greg Hemingway had finished medical school. He was a pre-med student, when I met him. He had finished medical school, and he was a resident in Boston. And he met John Merrill. John Merrill had been the crew doctor for the Enola Gay flight team. After the war, John Merrill led the team that did the first successful human kidney transplant. So he met Greg and he said, well, I'm working with Paul Dudley White. Paul Dudley White had been General Eisenhower's physician. And Dr. White is a person who first popularized the idea of bicycling as a healthy activity. We see now, the results of that. So Merrill said to Greg, well, what about going to Africa? We'll go big game hunting, and then you can do this project for 6 months in Gabon, traveling through Gabon and examining all the people in villages, because it had been suspected before that there was a lot of hypertension there. And what was discovered pretty much was that the hypertension, which is more prevalent in black people than white, it wasn't due, they first thought it was due to stress, racial discrimination, etc. But no, it seems to be genetic. So,
I'll take care of it.
During that 6 months, besides, there's a picture of I want to talk about. While I was there, I met a native doctor named Ngoa Michel. And then Goa Michaud used ibogaine in his ceremonies. He didn't have the extracted drug, but ibogaine is a large component of the iboga plant, and it's most prevalent in the covering of the roots of that plant. And Ngo Michel allowed me to participate in his Bawidi ceremonies. And I had taken LSD one time shortly before the last time I was in Africa. The last time I went there was a few weeks after Dr. Schweitzer died. I was so impressed by the results that I saw in Ngo Michel's ceremonies that after that 6 months was over, I went to Paris to a laboratory that was extracting ibogaine from the iboga root. And I learned that just before the Second World War began, ibogaine was available in microdoses. It was sold as a pickup tonic. They were mixing it with vitamins and a little bit of ibogaine, and it was an over-the-counter medication. There were people microdosing with ibogaine then. So I still have that bottle that you see. I learned that a young doctor named David Smith was doing some experiments at the University of California with, laboratory animals and psychoactive drugs. So David and I did, we were injecting these rats with, mostly with amphetamines and seeing the results of increasing the dose of the amphetamines and or decreasing their living space. And of course, they became more hostile and aggressive the less space they had and the more amphetamines they were receiving. And during that time, we did some experimentations on ourselves. And David and two of his friends had the idea of incorporating the little clinics that had been springing up in San Francisco by the diggers into one clinic that became the Haight-Ashbury Clinic. And I had the idea of writing about things. I was living in Berkeley then, and friends often would ask me questions about drugs, sexuality, or the combination of the two. And one time I spoke with Max Scheer, who was the publisher and originator of the Berkeley Barb. And I said, Max, you should have a medical column like the real newspapers. He said, well, why don't you write it? Well, I was interested in writing, but I'd never thought of, writing such a column. But I said, okay. And the first couple of columns I used consisted of questions that people were asking me. For example, people with diabetes, is marijuana going to affect my diabetes, my doses, what? It became a very popular column. And it eventually allowed me to meet and to work with a lot of notable people, as well as ordinary citizens. I became the family doctor for Timothy Leary, his children Susan and Jack, and his wife Rosemary. And I also, Alan Watts, It was Hunter Thompson, Eddie Fisher. I used to enjoy, once a year I'd visit Eddie Fisher. He had an apartment on California Street in San Francisco. And of course, in taking his initial history, one of the questions is, have you been married? Yes, how many times? He'd been married 4 or 5 times, including marriages to Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor. And his daughter, one of his daughters was Carrie Fisher, and she had a one-person show for a while, and she spoke of her father's medical marijuana use. And that was a service that I was asked to provide for Eddie. This led to my being invited to be on some radio shows. Initially on KMPX, and the first disc jockey who interviewed me there was Howard Hessman. So Howard went on to become the Johnny Fever in that television series, KRP in Cincinnati. Then I was asked to be on KSAN. So now we get to the radio part. Well, it was people, there was a great interest and hunger for information about drugs, and the information wasn't so easily accessible. Today, of course, people can go online and get information. It may be valid or not, but some of it is valid. But there was nothing like that available. It seems that I was the first medical doctor to deal with medical questions live on the radio. I didn't attempt to diagnose or treat individuals, but there were general questions and suggestions about where they could find help, whether it was with the local health department or the Haight-Ashbury Clinic, things of that sort. I had met by that time Margot St. James. Margot St. James founded the Coyote organization, a union of prostitutes. Coyote meant call off your old tired ethics. So people were calling up, and a woman called, and she said she was having difficulty performing oral sex. So Margot started out by saying, well, and she suggested practicing on a carrot or a cucumber. And then she said, and I won't repeat here how she said it, but she said that she found it easier to perform oral sex on women than fellatio on men. She didn't use those terms. I always use anatomical terms. She used, I just can't tell you now what she said. I could, but I don't think I will. Anyway, there was a couple in Palo Alto listening, and they said they had a teenage daughter, and they were highly offended by my program and what Margot had said. They sent letters of complaint to the radio station, to the Federal Communications Commission, and to the Department of Justice. The latter because we were broadcasting profanity, something like that. Well, it took the Metro Media lawyers who owned KSAN then, it took them months and about $250,000 in lawyers' fees to protect their their license. And I was able to get recommendations from the California State Health Department and various, other reliable, resources defending, what I was doing. So KSAN kept his license, and as soon as all that ended, so did my show. The backstory of that incident involves Paul Krasner, who had the Realist magazine. A few weeks before that, Paul had a show on another station, and he was very friendly with Margot St. James. And Margot went into his studio and distracted him, the way she knew best. And at the end, he said that this is the station that blows your mind. So he was fired from that station. He was auditioning for a program on KSAN, and I arrived with Margot, my guest, and Margot went into the studio and she started distracting him the same way. And he was describing some of it. For example, you'd have to know Paul to understand it fully. He was the top button of his fly had come off, and he was holding it together with a safety pin. So describing the safety pin being removed, and he was in the midst of reading memos purloined from Rolling Stone magazine about, how to advertise for the youth market. And every now and then you could hear a gasp. So the tape of his show, that show, mysteriously disappeared. Mysteriously disappeared. There was a show of the tape of Margot's appearance with me, was retained somehow. But Paul disappeared. Because things would have been much worse for KSAN had it been known, about that incident. But anyway, I was fired. Soon afterwards, Scott Beach, who was a friend of mine, he was employed at KSFO at the time. And he arranged for me to have a show on KSFO. And that was, KSFO then broadcast out of a studio in the basement of the Fairmont Hotel, and it was right across the hall from the Tonga Room. It was a tiki bar, kind of a fun place to go, and I guess some of the KSFO staff, that would go there during breaks. But anyway, the show was going out all right, but one day I was at a gathering in Muir Woods at Alan Watts' compound up here in Druid Heights. And Alan Watts was there, and Margot St. James, and Paul Krasner, and Jerry Rubin of the Yippies. So I said, well, I've got to go do my radio show, and I'll put you all on the air. He said, fine. So I went do my show, and I put on Alan Watts. He had, said a few wise words, and Alan Watts had this marvelous voice, and his tapes and his programs are still available and they're worthwhile. So he said some wise things. Paul tried to make a joke. I didn't put Margot on then. And Jerry put on Jerry Rubin. Jerry said, Gene, when you talk about sex, you really know what you're talking about because you were great last night. Well, there was no last night. You know, I was being pranked. And I said, you know, Jerry, I've found in my work that often people don't understand when someone is making a joke or is being sarcastic. He says, joke? That's no joke. You were great last night. So the next day, I was called into the office of the manager of KSFO and fired. The next radio show I had was at KFRC. And that was, Dr. Don Rose was still there, and I think Jasmine Collins. They decided I should do recorded 2-minute tips. Because it was recorded, there wouldn't be any such problem that had occurred in the past. Jan Yanahiro was the public affairs director at KFRC then. And we got along mostly. There was some censorship, you know, beforehand, but for the most part, everything was fine. And then once a week, I would go into her office and pick up mail because I invited people to send in questions. So one day, I walked into her office and I picked up the mail, and there was a postcard. Well, I don't know if you can see it. Anyway, it was sent from San Quentin. It was from Charles Manson. He wanted me to help him start a radio show for children. See, I'll tell you what he wrote on his card. He says, do you know or talk to Dr. Highland West? Dr. West was a psychologist at the Vacaville prison where Manson had been for a time. I'm a friend of his. Also hold much interest in what you are doing. I've got some projects I wish to put into motion. I want to know if you will work with me behind the money mind into new thought. Also, I want to hook your radio up with a radio in New York and an underworld kid radio system, a program called Talking Books in Circles, Family Circles, called Mind Cleanup. So when I showed this to Jan Yanahiro, she held up the card and she dropped it, shuddered, just dropped it. Yeah. The next day, she called and she said, Gene, there are 2 FBI agents here. They want to talk to you. I said, fine, send them. I had a little 1-room studio in North Beach. So these 2 FBI agents appeared 10 minutes later, you know, and there was the tall, grim one, and there was a shorter, friendlier, you know. And they looked around my office. At one wall, I had one of the, you know, big paper poster that was current at the time, advertising heroin cough drop syrups. You know, Bayer used to make heroin cough drop syrup. So we're looking at that, and they said, do you know Charles Manson? I said, no. Do you correspond with Charles Manson? No. Squeaky Fromme had just attempted to assassinate President Ford, and after that happened, they started monitoring Manson's corresponding, you know, coming in and out. And I had been told that he gave interviews sometimes to journalists. I was told that if you do that, soon his followers will be at your door. And he had a lot of followers. So I didn't care to do that. They wanted a copy of the card that I had. I didn't want to give them the original. I had a copying machine. I made a copy, gave that to them, and they left. Well, Gianna Hero and I received a National Broadcasting Award in 1976 for that program because it was recorded. Nothing much could have gone wrong then. Well, then I lived in Santa Cruz and Carmel for a while. I did a little radio work on a Christian station there. Of course, wasn't the same. And when I returned to the Bay Area, I was at a restaurant in Mill Valley, and I ran into Alex Bennett. I knew Alex because I'd been a guest on his radio show when he had a show in New York City. So Alex said, "Oh, come on to my show, as a guest," and I did that. And that led to Live 105 inviting me to do a regular show there. And that was thanks to Alex and to Richard Sands, who was the program director at Live 105 then. And I had the opportunity of working with such radio legends as Lisa Carr and Roland West. And of course, working with Richard. During that time, Kurt Cobain killed himself. And it devastated, the audience of Live 105, because Cobain's music was, very popular with them. So we spent a lot of time trying to reassure people and, comfort them. And that was I think, a good service that we provided there. Then, I had some interesting guests there, including Margot St. James. She, of course, cautioning her about and reminding her of the disaster that had come before, and she was fine. I also did one of the only radio interviews with Alexander Sasha Shulgin. Dr. Shulgin was the first person to discover the effects of MDMA or ecstasy or Molly on humans. And Sasha Shulgin also synthesized hundreds of other psychedelics, and tested them on himself and some of his friends. So I was on Live 105 for 3 years. And then the station was sold, to another corporation, and my show was replaced first by Howard Stern and then by Dr. Drew on Loveline. And I couldn't help but think, when I first was dealing with the topics, that they were dealing with, talking frankly about drugs and sexuality, Howard Stern and Dr. Drew were in elementary school. So that was the last regular work that I did. And now, presently, I do psychiatry. I see my patients almost wholly by Zoom or FaceTime. And I sometimes wonder, is there a place in radio? Is there an audience for people of older ages, such as my own? I don't know. Maybe. So let me go through here and see what we've got. There were several hundred underground papers that ran my column. There were some of them paid, most didn't, of course. But then the column was picked up by the San Francisco Chronicle, and then later it was syndicated through Universal Press Syndicate with some changes in the language. You know, in the underground press, I never changed language that people would use in asking questions, but had to do that for the mainstream papers. This is one of the first waterbeds. About 5 years ago, I was at a kind of a party in Berkeley, and this little old lady came up to me, and she said, "Do you remember me?" No. It was this lady with a joint years before. There's Tim Leary. When Tim was exiled in Switzerland, I flew over, to see him in Rosemary, and he found it was in a beautiful space, and I couldn't help but think then, gee, this is like Lenin. Lenin also was exiled to Switzerland. Tim was captured by the DA in Afghanistan and brought back, and his archivist asked me to see him and help get his new perfect love, Joanna, into the country. So I visited him in various prisons that he was in. Of course, he had escaped from prison. He was in prison initially for possession of, it was less than an ounce of marijuana. It's something like a 7-year sentence and more. So with the help of the weathermen, he escaped from prison. They provided fake passports for him and his wife, Rosemary. And he started to rat out some of his friends and associates because he thought he would never get out of prison. He may have been right, because he was mostly in prison because of what he was saying, because he was advocating, the use of LSD and other psychedelics. I remember him saying, everyone should take LSD once a week. Well, I tried that for a few weeks. It just wasn't consistent with the life, that I was leading and wanted to lead. I told him, I said, "Tim, you're telling these college kids to drop out. You've got a PhD and I've got an MD. This is not right." But first he ratted out his lawyer in Orange County. His name was George Chula. He asked Chula to bring him some hashish into the jail, which he did. And then Leary told the authorities, and that lawyer, was suspended, but only for a month from law practice. By then I was doing a lot of consulting work with lawyers, particularly with Tony Serra and his associates. And they wouldn't represent anyone who snitched on someone else because, what the DA would do, they'd arrest a low-level person and then tell them, things will go easier for you if you tell us your sources and, things of that sort. I just distance myself from him, at that point. I remember him at one point saying about Jack, who was 17 at the time, he said, "Can't you give him some Thorazine or something?" Well, any of you who have had teenage children, can understand what he was upset about. So there was a press conference called Leary's Lies, because he was informing on, various people, including accusing his lawyer at the time, of assisting him in the escaping. So they had a Leary's Lies press conference. A couple of days before that, I happened to see a movie about giant rabbits. And it gave me the idea, this is a kangaroo court they're doing. So I had a friend who dealt with costumes, and she provided me with a kangaroo costume. So there was this big press conference at the St. Francis Hotel, and suddenly, this kangaroo hops across the stage, and I had, in my pouch, my kangaroo pouch, I had a cream pie that I'd intended to put in Jerry Rubin's face as payback for what he had done to me before. But I was wearing gloves, boxing gloves, and I couldn't get the saran wrap off. So the moderator of the conference tried to pull me off the stage, and he pulled off the hat, revealing me. And there were people were saying, "Oh my God," and I knew that picture was going to go all over the world. It did. Because while I denounced him ratting on his friends, I thought it was really wrong for them to enlist his son, Jack, to help denounce him. I just did not think that was right. There's David Crosby. David was a friend, and then he became my patient, and he wrote about this in his first autobiography, Long Time Gone. Well, here's this picture you're seeing now is a picture of me standing with Johnny Cochran. Because my work with lawyers, I knew that when they had a speaker like that, afterwards, the principal speaker would stand with anyone, and pictures would be taken of it. So when it came time for me, I replaced the upper one there with something I wrote, "O.J. did it." And Cochran never saw it. Just as he turned to the camera, I switched to "O.J. did it." So Paul Krasner's wife, took this photo, and this was the cover of one of the last realist magazines. I was standing Hunter Thompson. I had various encounters with, here's what he wrote in one of his books. Thanks for the high blood pressure and the fear of massive contusions. Did that because he was doing a book tour and he decided he wanted to commune with the SEALs, off Seal Rock in San Francisco. And he slipped and fell down and bruised his face. And he was supposed to be interviewed, I think on KGO, and he didn't show up because he was all messed up. And I was listening to the show that he was supposed to be on. I heard, I think it was Owens, who was grumbling on, and he was supposed to have Hunter Thompson. He didn't show up. It messes things up when your guest just doesn't appear. So I was there when journalists would come to his room, and he'd be telling his stories. And one journalist, this woman, she was glad that I was there because they were afraid. All these stories came out about Hunter Thompson because he liked explosions, for example. And one of his former personal assistants told me that she couldn't stand it anymore. She couldn't stand the explosions, so she left. And on another occasion, when he was writing for ESPN, and he was covering the Hawaii Marathon, and he slipped in the bathroom, and he fell down and he fractured his fibula. And I was in Hawaii at the time. I was attending a wedding of Terrence Hallinan son. Terrence had just lost the DA election to Kamala Harris. And a friend, Mike Sapani, a mutual friend and lawyer, asked me to check on Hunter, who was in the hospital. So I went to the hospital, and we watched a little football together, and he had a cast on from his ankle up, his upper thigh. So he moved him, I helped move him off there and get back to the hotel. And then he had a number of visitors there from Switzerland. And he was in a much better mood after he had 2 or 3 margaritas. And he told these stories. He was very funny. I mean, I think that was the last time I had seen him, although we spoke by phone, and he invited me to see him. I never did do that, and of course we know what happened. There's a book available at Last Gasp Press. It's called Who Killed Hunter S. Thompson? And Warren Hinkle edited that. And of course, at that time, there was no thought that someone had killed Hunter Thompson except himself. His wife, Anita, he had an argument, and she said she was going to leave for a few days, and she was on the telephone with him when he shot himself, killed himself. And even though he had talked about suicide all his life, this was not something planned well in advance, because his son and his grandson were in an adjacent room when Hunter killed himself. More recently, Anita, somehow she asked the Colorado Department of Justice to investigate his death. You know, and all of us who knew Hunter had gone out, what is that? What possibly, why is she doing this? So we didn't know whether it was guilt, an estate dispute, didn't know, but the book, Who Killed Hunter S. Thompson, consists of articles by various people who knew him. I had a contribution to that book. Jerry Brown wrote there, and Johnny Depp. I think that book is still available from Last Gasp Press. This was, of course, this is a fake Last Supper, and we were doing this for Ed Rosenthal, who was about to be sentenced, possibly for a long prison term. But in there, I mean, Barry Melton is there. I'm in there. The housekeeper, the publicist, is standing up behind Ed. Herb Gold. There were a lot of, Merle Saunders was in there. Anyway, it was a kind of a prank. I mentioned a couple of pranks that had happened. Pranks, I don't know if it happens in radio now, but it was fairly common during that time. For example, once I was being interviewed by Michael Krasny, and into the studio came a photographer friend with a woman wearing a long fur coat. They entered the studio, and she removed the coat, revealing that that was the only garment that she had. Well, I mean, that's, as I say, I don't know if people still do pranks like that or not. But this is a, by the way, my daughter is here, Heather Schoenfeld. This is Heather's mother in her village in the Philippines. When I first visited there, they had no electricity. Some people had generators. Now they have electricity there, and they have one water line that goes through the village, and people can go to that water line and obtain water. But these are some photographs from that village. So this is Heather's mother, at the Bald Heart in San Francisco, and she got to see Barry Bonds hit a home run. And this is Heather then. This is Max Shearer, who starred the Berkeley Barb. And that's really how I got my start writing. And these were some of the columns. It was his idea to call the column Hippocrates because of the hippies. And he said, well, how about Hippocrates? I said, okay. But I always use my real name as well. So I have this from the, where is it? From the Department of, where to go? Anyway, I got favorable writings, thanks to the California Department of Public Health, and of course that helped with the KSAN matter. That's from KSAN. We took this picture in Golden Gate Park. I guess that's as long as my hair ever got then. Country Joe wrote this song, Dr. Hip. It's on one of his albums. But after a while, the questions started getting repetitive, and I thought, well, I've answered all these questions. I'm going to stop and do something else. About Pigpen, I met Pigpen of the Grateful Dead. He was another victim of alcoholism. I think Pigpen was 27 when he died of alcoholism. Then there was the White House drug scandal. Peter Bourne was President Carter's drug advisor. He's a drug czar. And during one of the NORML was the National Organization for Reform of Marijuana Laws, during one of their annual meetings in Washington, Hunter Thompson and Peter Bourne were upstairs in the room snorting cocaine. So there had been, and during the conference, there was a discussion about whether the United States, must adhere to an international pact made with other countries banning the use of marijuana. And this senator said, yes, that law supersedes our own laws. And it made me mad. And another person at that conference was Aaron Kay. Aaron was a pie thrower for a while. He would throw pies in the face of various people. So I turned to Aaron and I said, why don't you pie that fucker, And he said, they told me not to do it because he threatened me. I said, well, Aaron, what do you think they would tell you? He said, oh. So after a while, Aaron comes shuffling, and Aaron, very tall, big guy, comes shuffling down the aisle, and he throws the pie onto the stage, and it splatters all over, and it made the head of NORML at that time, very angry because he had told him not to do it, but he did it. And then after that happened, Bourne told the head of NORML, you've got to resign, you've got to leave, this is no good. And he said, well, if you force me to do that, I'm going to reveal your sniffing cocaine with Hunter Thompson and others. I said, oh. So Bourne had written a fake prescription for, I think, for roofies, for Quaaludes, I think. Supposedly used the name of his secretary, so we never knew whether it was for Bourne or for Carter. We didn't know who it was from, but it caused a big scandal when it came out, and Bourne had to leave, and it contributed to the defeat of Carter in the next election. So not only that, but prior to this scandal, with the cocaine sniffing, Carter was favorable to legalizing marijuana. And this set it back years. So I was in part responsible for the legalization of marijuana being delayed by 50 years or so, inadvertently. That's Tony Serra, famous lawyer. Phil Hartman. Do you remember Phil Hartman? He was with Saturday Night Live. I was asked to consult in the case it was brought because, his wife shot and killed him. And it was alleged that it was because of the prescription drugs that she was taking or whatever. But one of Phil Hartman's brothers met with me, and he asked me to spread some of his ashes in San Francisco Bay, which I did. And he also said, you can keep some of them for yourself. I still have some of Phil Hartman's ashes. I mean, I started a collection. I have some of Tim Leary's ashes because there was a memoriam done by Rosemary Leary, while she was alive. And she had they were like party favors. She mixed glitter with some of Tim's ashes, and all of us were invited to take some. So I have a small collection of cremated ashes. This is when there was controversy. Many Muslims objected to anyone satirizing or even condemning, the work of their prophet. This was, you can't draw me, that's why I draw you. This I had because there was talk about wanting to tear down Confederate flags, so. Okay, well, that's my story so far.
Does anybody have any questions for the good doctor?
I'd like to know what that last picture was, right before this one of the date pouch.
What?
There was like a bed or something?
Oh, I had a
That's the one.
yeah, I think that's Freud's. I think Freud had that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Back here.
Yeah. Stand up, please, so we can hear you.
Hi.
Hi.
As a teenager and a preteen in the 70s, you gave me so much education. There was no other source, and my parents didn't know shit. But I wanted to ask you, you currently practice in psychiatry, I understand, and you specialize in addiction-related stuff, right?
Yes, but I do general psychiatry, but I have a specialty in addictions. Yes.
Well, so this is the question that maybe pertains to this group. This is an institution of radio collectors, and collecting can be termed as an addiction at times. And I'm struggling with it, and I wonder if you have any advice for me.
Well, I'm dealing with the more recent phenomenon of teenagers and telephones. It's really interesting that they're, it's not just my teenagers. Teenagers are, many of them, addicted to the phone, to the detriment of reading and listening to the radio.
Hi, going back to the subject of cremated remains, human ashes, when you mentioned you had some two theories, this is a question that's been running around my head for a number of years. If one were to draw a line of ashes and snort it, would that be drug addiction or cannibalism?
Yes, there are many, many jokes and suggestions about what to do with cremated ashes. Yes.
Of all of your experiences, what would you do differently now that you look back on it? It could be good, it could be bad, just what would you do differently?
I don't know. Just as I didn't know then. I mean, I used to talk to Paul Krasner about things like that. That being first doesn't necessarily mean, you're going to be able to pay the rent by being first. Sometimes, but not for Paul and me.
Any other questions?
I'm curious, what do you think about the reemergence of psychedelics for PTSD and depression and stuff like that?
Yes, finally, after 60 years, we lost 60 years, because of Nixon's war on drugs. 60 years. And finally now there's a great interest in psychiatry and almost universal acceptance now of the idea that psychedelics can be used therapeutically. There are ongoing research studies at Johns Hopkins and now at UC San Francisco, at UCLA, and other institutions, but not with LSD. It's interesting because I think that of the psychedelics, it seems to be the most useful and safest. There haven't been any recorded overdose deaths, from taking too much. I've taken part in treatment of people who accidentally took enormous amounts of LSD. I was called one time because a woman and her friend, they were bored, her husband was away, and she knew that somewhere her husband had cocaine, and she found a vial with white powder. They put the lines out, and her friend sniffed it, and it was about 40,000 micrograms of LSD. So she was taken to the hospital, and this was in Santa Cruz. And I called to tell them, this is not an LSD bad trip. This is an overdose. And after a few days, she recovered. At first they had her on a ventilator because she told me later it was like she was breathing in, breathing out, breathing in. Another time, a woman, she was a friend of mine, she was cleaning the house, and she wanted some more energy to clean the house. And again, she found, white powder, spread it out, and took it, and she realized right away what had happened. And she called her husband, and she was at San Francisco General Hospital. And again, I have to call them, tell them, this is not a bad trip, this is an overdose. So she was just there for a couple of days and recovered. Both those individuals went on to continue using LSD, by the way. It was interesting. But
can you explain what's there lately? I mean, the last few years, people have been describing microdosing LSD.
yes,
For what purpose?
small doses of psychedelics act as a stimulant. I mean, I mentioned before that Ibogaine years ago was provided in microdoses, combined with vitamins, is kind of pickup tonic. And now, I mean, the same thing is happening now with LSD. It acts as a stimulant in the small doses that they're using. And that's why they're using it.
Is this for focus or?
You know, to focus, to do the things that a stimulant, you know, ordinarily does. And we have, you know, stimulants range from caffeine to amphetamines. That's why they're doing it.
Any other questions, thoughts, comments? Well, at this point, we'd like to thank Dr. Schoenfeld for coming up and telling us some great stories. You've all been invited to his birthday party.
Yes.
So watch your newsletter every Thursday night and we'll send out a little advertisement about it.
Yes, it's March 28th at the Throckmorton Theater in Mill Valley. Yes, and you folks are all invited. There's no admission charge. And I'm especially interested in people who are, as you are, interested in radio.